Okay, we're going to talk about different characteristics of vertebrates today. Remember, this is a subphylum in Chordata, where the notochord is going to turn into vertebrae before the animal is born or before the animal is hatched. So first of all of your vertebrates are going to have an endoskeleton versus an exoskeleton. Remember when we talked about the arthropods, we said they're going to have an exoskeleton where that support structure is on the outside of their body. Whereas with vertebrates, the support structure is on the inside. You know, your bones are all on the inside of your body. Okay. All of your vertebrates are going to have a closed circulatory system. We've been talking about an open circulatory system in a lot of the other animals, in our crayfish and our mollusks, where there are veins that the blood stays in part of the time, but then some of the time the blood washes over the tissues to allow for gas and nutrient exchange. In vertebrates, the system is always closed. So that means the blood is always contained within veins or arteries or capillaries. Capillaries are the little bitty tiny vessels that are down in the tissues where the gas exchange takes place. The other two main types of blood vessels are arteries and veins. Now your arteries carry blood away from the heart, and I remember that because both of them start with an A. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and veins are going to carry blood toward the heart. Now, you're going to have, in fact, I've seen this in some textbooks and some worksheets and workbooks where they try to tell you that arteries are always going to carry oxygenated blood and veins are always going to carry deoxygenated blood, but that is not the case. And so I don't want you to get confused about that. An artery is always going to carry blood away from the heart, but if you think about the circulatory system in humans, we've got kind of a double loop type of system, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next video. But there are some times where our heart is pumping blood directly to our lungs so that they can pick up more oxygen. In that case, the arteries are going to be carrying deoxygenated blood, but then once the blood picks up oxygen and goes back to the heart and then gets pumped to the rest of the body, at that point, the arteries are going to be carrying oxygenated blood. So just because it's an artery doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be carrying oxygenated blood, because if it pumps it to the lungs, then that's going to be deoxygenated blood. So the thing that you need to remember is don't worry about whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated in arteries and veins. Just remember that arteries are going to carry it away from the heart, veins are going to carry it toward the heart. All right. Another characteristic of vertebrates is that they have a nervous system that is controlled by the brain. And your author goes through the 5 main parts of a brain. And I want to go through those different parts and again, try to give you some memory tips to help you remember which part does what. The olfactory lobes are what controls our sense of smell. And the way I remember that is that within the word olfactory, you can see the word factory. And when I think of a factory, I realize that lots of factories are trying not to do this anymore. But when I think of a factory, I think of these big buildings with these big smokestacks, and they put out this nasty smelling smoke. And so if I think of a factory, I think, oh, factories, they smell bad. Okay. So again, hopefully most of our factories aren't polluting the air as much anymore as they used to be doing. Again, just a memory tip. Okay. Factory reminds me of the bad smell of a factory. Optic lobes are the part that controls our sight. So if you've ever been to an optometrist before to have your eyes checked or to get glasses, that's going to be, those 2 words are going to be what are going to help you remember that the optic lobes control the sight. The medulla oblongata, and that is a very, very long term there, but the medulla oblongata controls all of our vital functions and transport signals from the brain to our spinal cord. Now, when you talk about vital functions, we're talking about things like breathing, we're talking about things like making sure your heart keeps pumping. It would be extremely dull if you had to remember to tell your heart to beat and to remind yourself that you had to breathe all the time. I mean, can you think if I had to stand here and go, okay, heart, you have to beat. You have to beat about once every second. Beat, beat, beat. Oh, I have to breathe. Oh, my heart, I got my heart's got to keep beating. If I had to control my heart and my lungs to keep breathing all the time, I'd never be able to do anything else. I certainly couldn't teach biology because I'd be too busy keeping myself alive. And I can't think of anything more dull than having to tell my heart to keep beating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That would be a very dull thing for me to have to do. And I'm sure I would forget, because if I went to fix dinner, because obviously we have to eat too, I'd fix dinner and I'd forget to tell myself to breathe. And pretty soon I'd fall on the floor because my face would turn blue. And so I would not live a very long life because I would forget to do those things. So I'd be trying to do other things. So the medulla oblongata takes care of all those vital functions and all those things so that we don't have to remember to do them. It enables a long life for us because otherwise we would forget to keep our heart beating. Okay, so there's a memory tip for the medulla oblongata. It would be dull if we had to do it, but because the medulla oblongata does it, it will enable us to have a long life, or at least a longer life. All right, then the cerebrum integrates sensory information and coordinates our response to it. Brum kind of looks like, or at least it rhymes with the word drum, and we hear a drum, and so that's our sensory information of hearing. And so the fact that drum and brum rhyme with each other, that's what I use to remind myself that this integrates the sensory information for my brain. Okay. Also, this is the area where our thinking is in our cerebrum. And you may have heard of drumming your fingers. And so if you're drumming your fingers, you're doing this, drumming your fingers. And so people will sometimes drum their fingers when they're thinking. So I can use that word drum to remind me of a drum that I hear plus drumming my fingers, which is what I do when I think. So this is where all your thinking takes place, is in your cerebrum. Finally, your cerebellum controls a lot of your involuntary reactions, and it refines your muscle movements. You can do things like write and have really refined muscle movement. And the way I remember this is there's a bell in here, and yes, I hear a bell just like I heard the drum, but with the doorbell, let's say that I'm sitting on my couch and I'm reading a good book, and the doorbell rings and I jump. And so when I jump, that's an involuntary action because it startled me. And then I'm going to go get up to answer it. And so that requires muscle movement. Now, it's not refined muscle movement, but again, I'm just trying to give you some sort of tip to remember the differences between these different parts of the brain. Okay, so the cerebellum, the doorbell rings and you jump, which is an involuntary action. All right. Then the fourth characteristic of your vertebrates is the different types of reproduction that they have, different types of development they have. They talked about external versus internal fertilization. I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory, because if you have external fertilization, the female is going to lay the egg, and it's after it's laid that it's actually fertilized. We're going to see this in fish especially. It's probably where I think of it most commonly, where she lays all the eggs and then the male comes along and fertilizes them. A lot of animals, though, are going to have internal fertilization, where the egg is actually fertilized inside of the mother's body. Then we've got three different types of development. Once the egg is fertilized, the embryo has to develop until it's able to survive on its own, until it gets big enough. Okay, so there are three types of development. The first is oviparous, and that is where the egg is laid and it develops outside of the mother's body. And so that's like a chicken, that lays an egg. And so here I see this O, and that O reminds me of the shape of an egg. And so that's an egg outside the body. Now, ovoviviparous is an egg that develops inside the body. So then what I do with this one, I know it's a little wacky. And so if you can come up with better ways to remember those things, make sure you email me and then I'll put them in my next video. So with ovoviviparous, this looks like eyeglasses, and then this looks like a nose. So if I kind of make this nose, make that V just a little bit longer like that, it looks like a person that's wearing glasses. And what that reminds me of then is that Even if I have my glasses on, I cannot see the egg because the egg is inside of the mother's body. So I'm never going to see this egg. There are some types of fish that they have eggs that are fertilized internally, then they develop inside the body, and then they actually give birth to live young after the eggs have developed inside, okay? So you would need your glasses, but even if you have your glasses on, you're not going to be able to see the egg because it develops inside the body. And then finally, you have viviparous development. I said there's no egg. There is an egg because it's fertilized by the sperm, but the egg is not where the development takes place. The development takes place inside the female's uterus, and it's nourished by a placenta as opposed to being nourished by the nutrients that are inside of the egg, which again, we're going to hit a lot of this at the end of this module as well and talk more about how this egg actually functions to help that young develop. Okay, so those are your the characteristics of vertebrates, and then we will move on from here into looking at a perch.